All right, good evening and welcome to the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio. I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. Tonight we present the first of two events that celebrates Connecticut Freedom Trail Month. The two events focus on American abolitionist and social activist Harriet Tubman. Both events are part of NH250, an ongoing series of programming developed by the New Haven Museum to complement America 250. Culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the series will highlight inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting past and present. For tonight's program, following her escape from slavery in 1849, Tubman helped numerous others escape via the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, she worked as an armed scout and spy for the Union Army. She was later an activist for women's suffrage. Tonight, Deirdre Cooper Owens, an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut, presents Harriet Tubman, a disabled American hero. Cooper will discuss the life of Harriet Tubman through the lens of disability. She will explore how Tubman lived in a world of challenges and overcame difficult obstacles, most importantly, her enslavement. She was the most written about American woman of the 19th century, a war hero, activist, and philanthropist. Her life was a model in decency and democracy, Cooper says. Although there are numerous biographies about Harriet Tubman's life, none of them delve into her disabilities and how her conditions impacted her decision-making and life. Before her most recent appointment at the University of Connecticut, Owens simultaneously directed the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia and a medical humanities program at the University of Nebraska. During that time, she was the only Black woman in the country serving as director of an academic medical humanities program. She is a popular public speaker, has appeared in several documentaries, podcasts, and television newscasts as a historical expert, and is a nationally recognized reproductive justice advocate. She is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, a past American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Fellow, and an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society. Time magazine named her as one of the country's best historians. She has won several prestigious honors and awards for her scholarly and advocacy work in history and reproductive and birthing justice. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won a Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. She is currently working on a popular biography about Harriet Tubman that will examine her life through the lens of disability. Welcome, Deirdre.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here. I have to say I was a bit rattled. Connecticut drivers, that's all I'll say. I had to kind of collect myself. But it is wonderful to be here. I hope you have enjoyed the snacks I see they provided. Most times you don't even get a bottle of water and people have snacks for you and all of these wonderful things. And then I'd also like to send a thank you to what I call sometimes the invisible laborers, or not so invisible laborers, who help with sound and audio and lighting and keeping this place clean, providing us with snacks, the security downstairs, just all of the folk who we see sometimes and can sometimes forget that they help to make these programs possible. So I thank them as well. Thank you to Cynthia for inviting me. This is a topic that it diverges just a bit from my first project, which deals with the history of American medicine. This is a happier topic because Harriet Tubman died free. So that's always wonderful when you're a historian of U.S. slavery. But also, I was really interested in Tubman from a different lens, from that of disability in particular. And before I begin, I want to say I'm choosing very intentionally to use a contemporary term. 19th century Harriet Tubman would not have said, "I am disabled," right? She would have used different language and terminology, and she was in fact very vocal about the medical conditions that she had. But I want to be able to look at her life and her choices from that lens as best I can. And so I start off with a painting by Harry Seymour, who is a retired professor. He now resides in Martha's Vineyard, and he was inspired by Harriet Tubman's life. And so this picture is Esther, a fugitive slave, and she is escaping. But in the kind of symbolism, you can see that there's a train coming forward. And this is how most of us have learned about Harriet Tubman. I always say there are about 3 people we learn every February for Black History Month. Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and Sojourner Truth. Look, special shout out to George Washington Carver and the Peanut, right? And so, for most of us, it's the Underground Railroad, but she was so much more. I mean, she lived a really long life, and we'll get into that in just a bit. So this is something that some of you may know, others, perhaps you need a little memory boost, but the Fugitive Slave Act happened 175 years ago today, September 18th. It is so wonderful to have nerdy friends, because I was speaking to a girlfriend. I did another program last night in Hartford, and anyway, it was with Percival Everett, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, James. And so I was in conversation with him, and we were just talking. I was like, I get to talk about, it sounds so morbid. I get to talk about slavery again. But as an educator, right, most of us don't know this. And she said, the Fugitive Slave Act happened 175 years ago tomorrow. And I was like, I'm going to put that in the presentation. And so the U.S. Congress passes this restrictive act. But a year before, maybe a few months before, we're just not sure, but Harriet Tubman decided to liberate herself from enslavement in Maryland to a life of fugitivity and what I call a quasi-freedom in Pennsylvania. And I can tell you, obviously, there are a few pictures that exist of Tubman, but it was so hard, even in people's imaginations, to get a sense of Tubman in isolation. And this was the closest that I could get, right, where she is running away from slave catchers. And so for me to think about how a woman who had an invisible disability would have navigated this space by herself, right, suffering from, she would describe as fits of sleeplessness. Sometimes she would sleep all the time, these kind of fantastical hallucinations and visions, as she said, a worrying in her head, so, migraines, all of those kinds of things. And she is navigating this terrain by herself as a young woman. So who was Harriet Tubman? She was born enslaved around 1822, disabled. She was a fugitive, meaning she was in limbo between slavery and freedom. She was an abolitionist, as we know. An institution builder. I don't know if many people recognize how many institutions she helped to create and found, but we'll talk about that as well. She was a healer, a philanthropist, although never wealthy, a women's rights activist, very much a Christian. She was a proud member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I don't know if there are any AMEs, my maternal grandmother was, and she acted like she founded it with Richard Allen. She was always like, there's an AME. I was like, okay, right? But she was a proud Christian. And she died at 91 years old in the 20th century. So she lived a long life. And she lived a long life in freedom. And this is the thing, when we tend to think about Tubman, we almost always think about her tie to the Underground Railroad and not, in the nearly 70 years of freedom that she lived. So how did Harriet Tubman become disabled? It was a workplace injury. So I remember learning about this. I'd read about it, but just to actually go. So I went to Eastern Shore, Maryland with a few historians, and I remember I was toying with the idea of writing about Tubman. A couple of people had approached me, and I was like, I don't know, she's so written about. And then when I learned the story of how she sustained her injury, I was hooked. So Harriet Tubman, and I'm going to go by her birth name, Araminta Ross, and she was called Minty back then. So Araminta, right, she is going to run an errand for the man who has leased her. And often when I shared this fact with my students, they're like, lease? I was like, yes, like a car, right? I'm like, human beings were reduced to chattel property in terms of the legal definitions. And so she was leased to someone, right? And so she's going to run an errand at this store, the general store in Bucktown, Maryland. And she's a preteen. And so as she's going to run this errand, she encounters a 14-year-old runaway and an overseer who is chasing him. And so she's witness to this, and the overseer is yelling at Araminta, catch him, catch him. Now this is the thing about Harriet Tubman. As a grown woman, she was no more than 5 feet tall. So one can imagine how small she was as a child. And the overseer is saying to her, catch him, catch him. And so now there are different interpretations. Some people believe she didn't know what to do, she didn't involve herself. There are others, like the other Pulitzer Prize winning author, Edna Black Fields, who believes she inserted herself. And so there are different interpretations, we don't know, right? She never left any written records because she remained illiterate her entire life. But as she enters into the store, and so does the 14-year-old, and so does the overseer, and they're running around, the overseer is so overcome with anger, he takes a 2.5-pound weight, and he throws it at the boy. It unfortunately hits Harriet. So frontal lobe injury, and she is knocked unconscious and bloodied. And so folk assume she's going to die. And she is brought back to her mother, who is enslaved. Her father had been manumitted or freed. So she's brought back to her mother and her grandmother, and they nurse her. So I'm going to put a pin in that and just kind of explain how we tend to think about people who were enslaved in terms of their physicality, but what slavery actually was. So slavery as a manifestation of anti-blackness or racism was debilitating. It was not a system where people were meant to be healthy. Right? So the physical manifestations of this practice were experienced through violence. Tubman experienced this trauma and became disabled as a workplace injury. Freedom and medicinal practices served as resistive responses to racism. So when she is knocked unconscious and bloodied and thought to die, and so she's essentially not returned to the owner or even the person who leased her, she's sent to her mother and the grandmother because they, the folk who own her are like, well, at least she can, she's a child, she can die at her family's home. But Tubman had always asserted later in life that her grandmother was an Ashanti, meaning she was from the Gold Coast of Ghana, and that her mother and her grandmother nursed her back to health, right? Applying the healing arts. Now before, every time Q&A, I'm going to bust your bubble. Call me a fortune teller. Please do not ask me what her remedies were. I don't know. Every day, every time I talk about Tubman, somebody asks me, but what did she do? I don't know. Right? The only thing I can do is give you a little bit of what I know from her interviews. That I don't know what they did, but she was healed. But her value becomes reduced economically, right? So literally the price tag on her head is reduced because the owner says she wasn't even worth about 6 pence. I couldn't sell her if I wanted to. And so she recuperates and she gains her strength. But from that point on, from pre-teen years until her death, she suffered from seizures, migraines, hallucinations, insomnia, narcolepsy, right? Painful conditions. And and this is the thing, she would tell people about them, but the folks who encountered her, sometimes they didn't know if she was sane. Back then they would have said, was she a victim of lunacy? They just weren't sure. And then, she could be talking to you, and next thing you know, she's sleeping. So this is a woman who's had to negotiate a change in her physical life, but also, her mental state around this. So Harriet Tubman's disability troubles the notion in the 19th century practice that the black body was supposed to be an able body, right? That it was meant for slavery and not freedom. What then do we make of the disabled black enslaved body? As a slave, she was devalued. As a free person, she was at risk of being exploited and further injured. Without ever denying the role and function of disability in her life, Harriet Tubman presented the opportunity for those considered normal to make themselves malleable to her specific needs. Often, when I was the director of the Medical Humanities program in Nebraska, I would often talk with my students when I was teaching a History of American Medicine class. I'm like, before there was ever a 1990s Americans with Disabilities Act, I was like, there were so many people who were visibly disabled in the 19th century. To think about the kinds of physical labor people are engaged in with the cultivation of cash crops, right? So if you are chopping tobacco, there's the chance that you might cut a digit or a limb, right? I grew up in South Carolina for high school in the Low Country, and this is true. My high school mascot was the boll weevil, because and I graduated in 1990 now. I'm AARP age, not quite Social Security age yet. But we had a cotton field across the street from our high school. And if you have ever picked cotton, I have not, but I have spoken with folk who have, to try to put your fingers into the bolls scratches you, but also the boll weevils bite. So everything that you're engaged in, right, from the amputations, it is arduous labor. And so often when we think about enslaved people, we are thinking about these healthy people, these physically kind of perfect specimens for manual labor, and yet so many of them were lame, they were blind, they were amputees. And so Harriet Tubman represents a 19th century world filled with disabled people. And this is the thing, when you are in that space, you are literally having to have others negotiate how to make space and room for you, because it is so common, right? And so I tend to think that people who lived in the 19th century had a much better way of adapting to disability than we do today. Even I call them the triptych of Black abolitionists of the 19th century, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Jacobs, and Harriet Tubman, they were all, quote unquote, disabled. In the 21st century, they would have needed an accommodation support, right? Because Sojourner Truth could not move her right arm, right? So she was, what they would have called lame in her right arm, which is why in pictures, she would always have it hidden. Harriet Jacobs, who wrote the first autobiography in the United States from someone who was, a fugitive, she suffered today in what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder because of the 7 years living in a garret, the extreme sexual harassment that she suffered, right? Having to hide from her children for 7 years, but she writes about in her hallucinations, the way her body was bent in the narrowness of a garret in her grandmother's home. Right? And this is the thing. Almost all of these folk, when they talked about these experiences, were discounted until the primary sources backed up what they said. Even with Harriet Tubman and the Akan, Ghanaian-born grandmother, oh no, she just said that because she probably heard it, and then I'll show you how you need to listen to what our ancestors tell us. Because oftentimes it is mired in much more fact than fiction. So here you have these enslaved, disabled abolitionists, and we often don't think about them as disabled. And so with this way of seeing the world through a different kind of thinking because of the frontal lobe injury that she had, also her enslavement, Harriet Tubman, she becomes infatuated with freedom, with liberation. And her Christian faith, which grows as she grows up, is strengthened. And so she develops a freedom mantra. God's time is always near. He gave me my strength, and he set the North Star in the heavens. He meant I should be free, right? And that there was nothing that was going to confine her, not even her medical conditions. And so now this is where I have to let folk know, right, that I am actually a scholar. I do have to impress people with theory. And so if you will allow me, I came up with these kind of theoretical interventions, I like to call them. But one is a spiritual photography. And then I have another called Fugitive Logic when I think about Harriet Tubman. And they're still works in progress. But the thing that made me think about spiritual map making or reading with Harriet Tubman is, I mentioned this before, she remained illiterate her entire life. And so how does someone who can't read a map know how to escape successfully 13 times? How is this possible, right? And so I'm, really thinking about this, and it's not to be hyperbolic. Often when people are involved in writing biographies, they fall in love with the historical subjects, and I do have a little girl crush on her, but I'm also weighing this with some historical objectivity. And so when I started to think about what she said in interviews, but also things that just make common sense then and now, the idea of a spiritual cartography, right? I think first comes from this vision of, and so I'll read to my right the example of the spiritual cartography. First comes from a quotation attributed to Tubman in the first autobiography written by her, Scenes in the Life of Tubman, 1869. So the author kind of moves between her voice and then that of Tubman, or at least what she believes Tubman said. Before her escape from slavery, she used to dream of flying over fields and towns and rivers and mountains, looking down upon them like a bird, and reaching at last a great fence or sometimes a river, over which she would try to fly. But it appeared like I wouldn't have the strength, and just as I was sinking down, there would be ladies all dressed in white over there, and they would put out their arms and pull me across. So spiritual cartography, based on what I read, the mental drawing of liberatory maps based on a Protestant, God-centric, human, relational sense of being to one's environment. How do you interact with God's green earth? Spiritual cartography also functioned in Harriet Tubman's life as both a theory and a praxis, or a practice, related to justice and liberation. This is about also the enslaved person's ancestral knowledge, in her case from West Africa, but also the fusion, right, or the kind of synergistic relationship between Protestant Christianity and this African-American cosmology and their place in the universe. Spiritual cartography was about communalism, which sat at the center of citizenship and freedom. Now, what does that mean based on this quote? All right. In plain speak, what that means is Harriet Tubman told her biographer about her visions. This is the thing, she always had a vision before she planned an escape. And she saw that vision as being from God. That God placed this vision in her mind. And this is the thing about Tubman as well. When we think about Tubman, when we read about Tubman, when we've seen Tubman depicted in movies or plays, she is always seen as this courageous and brave leader, willing to fight anybody, has her pistol beside her. In fact, even in the Smithsonian, there's a copy of her Bible and her gun, right? That's how we see Tubman. But if we look at Tubman's words, but it appeared like I wouldn't have the strength. And just as I was sinking down, there would be ladies all dressed in white over there, and they would put out their arms and pull me across. She's letting you know, in my weakest, most vulnerable and fragile state, it was a community of women dressed in white who held their arms out to save me, to rescue me as I was falling. This is a way that we can reinterpret, I think, the ways that other scholars have seen Tubman, right? That people are much more complex, much more multidimensional than the kind of kind of flattened caricatures or tropes that we have of them, that she's letting you know in her weakest state. But I think that there is also something else. And this is what I tend to tell my students. I'm like, let me give you a GRE word. It's called gynocentric, right? Where women sit at the center of this thing. And the women, right? It's a community of women dressed in white. There have been all kinds of misinterpretations of this, but I link it to the West African cosmology, right? That's connected to her grandmother. I will never forget this when I was contemplating, okay, do I write this biography? And then when I watched the Academy Awards, Viola Davis came up dressed beautifully in white, and she recited this very quotation. And she said, you see, Tubman had a vision of an integrated world where black and white women would help each other and save each other. That's not what she said. She said the women were dressed in white. This is why I keep telling my students, I'm like, Hollywood entertainment. The books that y'all think are boring really contain a lot of, that's where the richness is contained, right? That's where you can see the words. She didn't say black and white women, she said women dressed in white. That becomes important. And a couple of slides later, we'll go back to that. So I'm dropping these because I want us to go and you can say, okay, now there was a method to her madness with all the information bomb. All right, so hold that. Now the fugitive logic. This is the other misinformation I think we've heard about Tubman. How many of you, even in the movie where the great late Cicely Tyson played Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people. I was in elementary school, so it hadn't been in the late 70s or early 80s, but she goes in and she's, singing at night, some Negro spiritual, as it was called back then, to alert the folk that Moses has come. Fugitive logic. There's a form of thinking rooted in observation methodology, right, the way you do a thing and the mobility of the environment, but also makes space in the thinker's mind for folks and beings who control and manipulate the environment, like enslavers or members of the animal community. If you are a fugitive, like Tubman was, why are you going to come in the dead of night singing loudly and awaken everybody? Hey, y'all, I'm here to steal your slaves. That does not make any sense at all. It makes no sense. And this is the other thing. Where do we think enslaved people lived? Next to the folk who owned them. So you mean to tell me that no white person ever figured out what the meaning of the spiritual was? If you lay out a quilt, you don't think somebody after a time or two is going to say, you know what, every time I lose 3 slaves, there's a quilt hanging up. Like we have to, these are not dumb people. They're human beings, right? I can figure out after about 2 times, so my students are cheating or laughing at me. I mean, so this is the thing, the fugitive logic. So she's paying attention to everything because she can't read. So that means when she goes there, she's not going to sing a song. Okay, the hooting owl makes this sound around this time of night. So I know when I come in, I can mimic the sound of the owl or a bird. Right? Those are the kinds of things. Building a relationship with what's around you. Okay, so I know that around the time the dew comes, I might be able to do X, Y, and Z, right? I can move a little more quietly in the grass. It's not going to crunch. Those kinds of things, right? There are all kinds of reports from Tubman's friends and family that she moved so quietly and furtively. You could be standing here by yourself and then you look and she's there and you've never known that she was coming towards you, right? This is the kind of fugitive logic. Now, I don't make the kind of big claims like she was an astrologer, an astronomer, I don't know those things. But what I do know, right, is this is someone who knew the environment quite well. How did she know the environment, though? When she couldn't read a map. When she was a little girl, she would accompany her father on walks. And if you start to look at some of the architectural history of the area where she's from in Eastern Shore, Maryland, you realize that a great dam was being built. And so what does that mean, right? There are people standing on top of hills and they're digging down and all of those things. And her father would often take her, to see the men who are building the dam and constructing it. And so the thing is, though, when we start to think about it, she's standing on top, right, of a space that allows her a clear view of the environment. And when you can't read, you remember things. I'm 53. I didn't learn to drive until I was 37. Don't judge me, judge your mama, right? So, the thing is though, my husband, who was driving since he was 15, he never remembered landmarks, but I always did, because I couldn't drive. So I didn't know, but I was like, oh, you know the one with the McDonald's on the corner that's about blah, 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 right? So listen, we make up for what we don't know. And so she had a photographic memory. I mean, people who talked about Tubman talked about what she could remember. And so she also, smartly, right, it wasn't just kind of looking over the landscape and the terrain, but also she asked her owner, can I lease myself out? And she begins working next to the docks so that she can hear the sailors and she can ask questions. Who suspects a little girl or a young woman, right? And so she's finding out, okay, this is north, this is west, this is south, right? And she's connecting that with the environment as well. So fugitive logic. Now that's just my theory making, right? That's it. Those are the only two that I have right now. Now, remember I said she also, in this quotation of the women in her dream dressed in white. For years, people were saying, there's no proof. There's no proof. Guess what they found just a few years ago? You can Google it. About 2 years ago. Archaeologists, on her very birthplace, a cachet of West African spiritual kind of, I call them kind of, ephemera. You can see there's glass and there were, fabric that's wrapped around things in specific colors. And guess where it's tied to? Ghana. So the very thing she's telling people wasn't this kind of conjecture because she wanted to be connected to something that she saw as royal, but she was saying, no, my grandmother told us she was born in Ghana. And she says, I'm an Akan, right? I'm an Ashanti woman. And so much of the healing practices that she learned, right, I suspect came when her mother and grandmother were healing her while she was recovering from the injury. Right? And that there probably also was a community of people like her grandmother who had been born on the continent of coastal West Africa, right? For these archaeologists to be able to find, right, this kind of treasure trove of archaeological items that's related to these spiritual practices. The other thing that I had to incorporate this in, because like I said, I always get the questions. What did she do? I don't know. But what I do know, right? If we understand what Tubman knew about the swampy eastern shore in Maryland, right, is that there were certain things that were locally grown, that was local or indigenous to the area. So cranesbill or wild geranium, water lilies. And I have to do this only for a reason, because I have notes here that explains, what it is. Okay, let's see here. Many people, so Harriet Tubman talked about this later after the Civil War. She worked in a Civil War hospital in South Carolina. Many people died from dysentery, a disease associated with terrible diarrhea. Tubman was sure she could help cure the sickness if she could find some of the same roots and herbs that grew in Maryland, because she knew that. So one night she searched the woods until she found the cranesbill or wild geranium that helped with the dysentery, right, stopping the diarrhea. The water lilies help with when blood sugar would dip low, it could help to bring it up, right? So these are things that she learned. And even though, South Carolina's low country is a different kind of wetland from Eastern Shore, Maryland, but she knew what those plants and those herbs could provide in terms of healing, right, for those patients. And one can surmise that she probably was also, using some of those herbs and those roots with the other fugitives that she went to rescue in Eastern Shore, Maryland, as she was bringing them to freedom. Now, the other thing Harriet Tubman has, did while she is still suffering from these conditions, she is freeing folk. Now, when I was in school, I learned that she freed over 300 people. Not true. Not true. I don't care if she freed 2. Still amazing, right? Still an amazing feat. But if you go to her museum, it's a wonderful museum in Eastern Shore, Maryland. The National Park Service created it. You find, they've done meticulous research in conjunction with one of her biographers, Kate Clifford Larson, who wrote a biography of Tubman in the late 90s, They found almost all of her trips back to Eastern Shore, Maryland, beginning in 1850. Now, isn't that something? Remember, she liberated herself a few months or a year before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. She commences to liberating other enslaved people in 1850. When the United States has the most restrictive fugitive slave law, right, of its time. And so this is dangerous. So she goes back and she gets her friends and her family members. I often share with students, I've taught a slavery and film course a couple of times, and we go through these popular films, and one of them is Django, Quentin Tarantino. And in it, Django, played by Jamie Foxx, he is on a mission to free his wife, Broomhilda, played by Kerry Washington. And so he goes through hell and high water to free Broomhilda. And I was like, let me tell y'all how this is not accurate at all and meant for your entertainment. Because most people, like Harriet Tubman, even folk who were planning uprisings, it was never an individualistic act. It was always communal. Always communal. Remember, even in her quote-unquote hallucinations or visions, it was about a community of people holding her up. And so when she goes back to free folk, she's going back to free multiple people. And you can literally see from December 1850, and I'll have several slides all the way to the 1860s, you see there are a number of people ranging in different ages, right? Men and women, family members, friends who she collects to take to freedom, right? And the other thing is, Harriet Tubman is so smart at this point because she goes when she knows that people are, and I'm using air quotes here, resting as much as they can. So typically during Christmas and New Year's, there's a lessened work schedule for the enslaved. And so she goes and she gets these folks. In total, about 76 people over the course of about a 12-year period or so. What does she do in between that time, right? Well, she works. That's the one thing you know to do when you were enslaved and when you are living in fugitivity. She works. And she performs domestic labor. And so she goes to places like Cape May, New Jersey, which was then known as America's richest resort town. And it also was a hotbed of activity for rich white abolitionists. And so she's actually hidden in plain sight. So here's this woman who is the most notorious fugitive. All kinds of bills, for her return and advertisements. And here she is working as a cook and a maid in these private homes and in these restaurants in Cape May. And she's gathering information, but also she is making relationships with people. Because as much as we laud Harriet Tubman, right, as a leader in the Underground Railroad, she can't do this alone. She's still a black woman who is breaking the law in the 19th century during the era of enslavement. And so she has to form relationships with white folk who are also willing to put their lives and their possible freedom on the line. And so to think about the ways, for me, is just, amazing. The ways, that Harriet Tubman is able to form these relationships and convince people, right, to hide folk or to give them food or to give her money, right, is incredible. And so in Cape May, she returns to work, she earns money, and she's using it for liberation trips, as I call them. She also goes even farther north, and she goes to St. Catharines, Canada, right outside of Ontario. She lived in her North Street home with members of her family. She housed newly arrived refugees, offered food and clothing to them, and housed local orphans. She helped Reverend Hiram Wilson with his new charity that assisted newly arrived fugitives. And in 1861, that's the start of the Civil War, she founded a benevolent organization with her brother, William Henry, called the Fugitive Aid Society of St. Catharines to provide recent refugees with aid. So when I say she's an institution builder, right, it's not kind of like this hyperbolic language. You're just trying to keep accolades on her. She's constantly thinking about the community. And she's literally using her body, right, her blood, sweat, equity to create these spaces in conjunction with the Black church, right, and her family. So she helps her brother escape to freedom, and in turn, they create an organization to help people who are even less fortunate. And there's still a legacy, with Tubman. You go to Cape May, there's a Harriet Tubman Museum that is right next to the church that she would frequent when she was there. Right? There is Salem Chapel in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, the last stop on the Underground Railroad. She brings at least 200 slaves to freedom. The Harriet Tubman Historical Society reports the figure at about 100 more, according to their records in Canada. The first time Tubman came to St. Catharines, she brought 11 fugitive slaves with her. She made approximately 19 trips over a 10-year period. Tubman's brother Moses was one of the first fugitives she brought to St. Catharines a couple of years later. She brought her parents to the city. If you go to the museum in Eastern Shore, Maryland, the last trip she makes there is I was like, how in the world is she playing this? But she brings her father, who's free, but he's still married to his wife, who was enslaved, right? The wife's owner never freed her, even though he was supposed to, and the legal documents showed he was supposed to manumit her. But what does that matter when you're enslaved, right? And so she goes to basically free her elderly parents, and even creates like a little wagon for them to hide in, and there's like a pallet and straw. And I was like, how in the world do you bring people out with a wagon with a pallet for them to sit and be comfortable? Amazing, right? And so they're the last trip that she takes to Maryland, but she brings them to Canada. So even in fugitivity, here she is constantly, right, going back and forth between domestic labor, giving speeches, raising money with her church, tending to family members and to the organizations. And she even creates a boarding house, right, for the indigent, typically orphans, and the elderly, who are housing compromised, as we would call it today. And there's a very famous picture of Tubman. She's the one holding the bowl with her adopted daughter, Gertie, who's standing beside her. And then there's a gentleman there, in fact, two men who are seated. The one with the cane is her husband, her second husband. So she did find love with a man who was about 25 years younger, but that's another story, right? She found love in the Civil War, I'm just saying. So, her heart was broken. There's a story for everybody. The first husband, she's like, come on, I know you're free, but come on with me now. We can build a life. No, I'm not going. So she was like, all right, peace. Heartbroken. So a lot of us women, boy, you can get the best grades when your heart is broken, right? You can get the best body, working out, all of these things. She was like, all right, I'm going to really devote myself to this freedom thing. And look at what she does. And in the midst of helping to free folk during the Civil War, she meets the husband. And she outlives him. But it was really until death do us part, right? So I'm always so happy. But I'm like, at least she got love again, right? With this man who seemed to adore her. And in the later stages of her life, the John Brown home, who was one of her dearest contemporaries and friends, right, for the age that she names when she's in New York. Lest we forget, she's doing all of this now with an immense physical pain. She also founds the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. I mean, amazing, right? Anybody who, I don't know, by show of hands, I don't have on my glasses, but I can see your hands. Any of the black women here, maybe white, I don't know, who are members of black sororities? Black sororities? What are you?
It's not one of the official ones.
That's okay. Okay. I'm a Sigma Gamma Rho. My mama's a Delta, right? Black Women's Club movement. That's what starts it all. National Council of Negro Women, as it was then called, right? NCNW, still in existence. That's Tubman was a founder, right there with Ida B. Wells. In fact, they say when Ida B. Wells was there, because they all adored her and had the greatest respect, Ida B. Wells hands Tubman her baby in this kind of symbolic move where Tubman carries the baby at the first convention, right? Holds the baby up, kind of a passing of the torch. And then there is something else that I think is really beautiful. The last picture you see here is of Tubman in a white shawl that Queen Victoria gifted her. And I said, isn't this like a kind of moment? But she was envisioning women dressed in white saving her, and now look at the woman who is dressed in white, clothed by a queen in admiration, right? I mean, just an amazing life, but not all good. Because around this same time in the late 1890s, Harriet Tubman, I don't have this in the slide, but she's attacked by two men who say, hey, we found Confederate gold, and we can sell it to you for a good price. And I think she forgets that she was a senior citizen, and she goes in the woods, and they beat her bloody and steal the money, and she was ridiculed. She was called all kinds of fools. And even when my students, I showed them the newspaper clippings. But why would she do that? Have you ever been poor? Imagine having access to all of these things and all of these elite people, and yet you don't have money, so you fall for a con because you have all of these institutions that you've created to maintain. You literally don't have any money. You're a widow. Your husband is dead. And on top of this, you're sick. So around this time, she finally says, you know what, I can't deal with this anymore. Let me go get surgery. And so these are quotations from newspaper articles. She is in Boston, and she says she sees a great big hospital. We know it's the Massachusetts General Hospital. And she asked the man what it was. He said it was a hospital. She goes in. She sees a young man there. And I said, sir, you're a doctor? He said he was. And then I said, sir, do you think you could cut my head open? Then I told him the whole story and how my head was giving me a powerful sight of trouble lately with aching and buzzing, so I couldn't get no sleep at night. He says, okay, you can, and obviously he knows this is Harriet Tubman. Offers her anesthesia. She refuses, instead preferring to bite on a bullet like the soldiers she saw undergoing amputation during the Civil War. She laid down, and she says, I just laid down like a lamb before a slaughter, and he sawed open my skull and raised it up, and now it feels more comfortable. It hurt, of course, but I got up and put on my bonnet and started to walk home. But my legs kind of give out under me, and they sent for an ambulance and sent me home. So I was like, do y'all look, maybe, my students, so I said, so now do you understand why she thought she could go in the woods and get money, right? I mean, she really thought she could just get up after brain surgery and go home, right? And so, but once again, here's another moment where she's telling you about her vulnerability, her fragility, her fragile state. And often people will tell you about themselves, and we are so invested in the image that we don't even hear their words. She literally is saying, I was in pain. I was in a vulnerable state. And yet we ignore that. That was the Moses of our people. Okay, she was. But she was also a poor woman who suffered with illness, until the 1890s, where she elected to get brain surgery without anesthesia. And anesthesia existed at this time. Right? To imagine the kind of choice that you make. But this might also give a bit more context. Now, remember I said the second husband and Tubman were Civil War veterans by this point. She is not given a pension. Now, she certainly couldn't get a pension for herself because she was a woman, even though she was recruited, right, by the U.S. government to serve in the capacity of nurse and war scout and spy. But she was never given her pension, so she figures, okay, my husband's dead, let's see if I can get a pension. And based on what we do have, these claims, and if you read Etta Fields Blackfield's Cumby, which won the Pulitzer, she does an amazing and meticulous job of research looking at those pension claims, right? Because there were people who were like, she didn't do anything. Etta was like, okay, got it. Let's look at the pension records. And you could literally look in these pension records, thousands of them, from that area of Port Royal in the Low Country, and so many of the men and women talked about Harriet Tubman being there in the work that she did. Now those critics are silent, right? I'm like, the primary sources can do all of the talking for you often. So here's a pension claim. Then there's an act to increase the pension. She doesn't receive it until 12 years later, almost. And it's not enough. So that house, if I go back a couple of slides, that John Brown home for the aged, right? She has to literally ask her church to buy the land from her because she can't afford to keep the house up. And then she has to become a resident of that home for the aged. So this is not a woman who dies with wealth. So in all of this, and this is a work in progress for me, right? This is hopefully book number 2, and I have a whole lot more work to do. But, so you all are here kind of, this is I don't know, we can call it a workshop of sorts. I'd love to hear your comments and your questions. But I'm thinking about how do I reframe the ways that we think about freedom if we look at healing and care, right, in this kind of micro case of Harriet Tubman. And so this is from an article I wrote for Ms. Magazine 3 years ago. In the United States, the most dispossessed, like Tubman, practiced a democracy that should have modeled for the country how to live out its political ideals. Tubman created sustainable communities where democracy was not only centered, but Black women could execute power collectively. In our retellings of American history and its heroines, we must reckon with how a more holistic and honest rendering of our past can transform the ways we think about those who came before us. What lessons might we learn, and more importantly, how do we position ourselves to honor politically those who've been marginalized for far too long? So I thank you. I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you for coming. I love this picture of her, so I feel like that's an appropriate picture for us to look at. Any questions or comments? I can now see you. I've learned to take my glasses off because people sometimes, if they don't like what you're saying, they're like this. And I don't want to see it, so I put my glasses on after the talk. All right. Yes, sir.
First of all, amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Amazing presentation. I believe it was all, I've heard that there were other conductors that Harriet trained.
Oh.
And I don't know if you can corroborate that, there were other conductors that she trained to do the work that she was doing?
You know what? Maybe that I haven't come across, but this is a thing too. And tell me your first name. Frank poses a great question where I am always okay to say I don't know. It might have existed, but this is the thing. When you're dealing with the history of slavery and you're centered on not the slave owners, right, or the legislators who are making the rules around slavery, you're focused on the people who were enslaved. Most of them were illiterate and did not leave written records. And so it's a lot of detective work that takes a lot of time. So it might have, those folk might have existed, but this is the other thing too. You are doing work that is supposed to stay secret. you know. And so that might possibly be the case. There could be records that are unearthed. I do some community work with the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, and one of the staffers there, Dr. Kat White, she just went in the archives to look for something, and she's going through and she finds this, like a slim manuscript, and she's like, what is this? It was an unpublished manuscript of a formerly enslaved man. So this is, and it was just there for well over 150 years, right? And so we're now trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? So it might the information might very well be there. We just don't know. But thank you. Yes?
What was the most challenging part of your research or learning that was based on that?
Ooh, the most challenging part is people who are asking me, including my agent, so when are you gonna get this done? So the most challenging part, and what's your first name? Jenny, thank you. I think the most challenging part for any historian of slavery is that it takes a really long time. As I was sharing with Percival Everett, I said there is something about being a novelist that I like because there's the speculative, but also the creativity to be able to create based on the records. Because of the tools of history, it can, I love my profession, but it can be a little restrictive. And it takes a really long time. But also, you are constantly looking through records of folk who denied the humanity of the people that they own. And so you're trying to extract something that is compassionate and three-dimensional about the folk. So that is difficult. And with Tubman, I think what is scary for me, just last year, 2 books came out about Tubman, and one won a Pulitzer. And both these women are my friends. In fact, I'm in a writing group with Taya Miles, and so there's this sense too of like, what can I say that's new? But I know I'm on the right track because I was at, it was the Southern Historical Association, and the great Catherine Clinton, who was a mentor of mine, who also wrote a biography of Tubman. It was Catherine, me, Etta Fields Black, and Taya Miles, all biographers of Tubman. And I said that my first research trip was the toughest because I wanted to understand her from the perspective of being in a city where Black people were like her. They were in this kind of quasi-freedom. And so that was Beaufort, South Carolina. I'm originally from the Low Country. I was born in Georgetown, South Carolina, in this Gullah Geechee nation. And so when I go, I'm kind of like, okay, what do I look for? I'm not finding a lot in the archives. And so I remember, I'm ashamed to say it, but my husband said, just do what you like to do. So I went shopping at the outlet mall in Hilton Head. And I remember I was talking, and anyway, the cashier and I were talking, come to find out her husband owned the Hilton Head Theater. And she says, we're having a play here. She gave me tickets. I said, I'll come. So I go the next day, and she says, she must have Googled me because she found my Instagram. If y'all are over 50, please use social media because people will find you. And so she finds me, and she says, oh, I've been reading about your work. I don't know if you knew this, Harriet Tubman didn't come into Beaufort. She actually came into Hilton Head, but there's this old island. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm doing my research, and then I go, and I remember just kind of walking in the place where the boats could have landed, and where she had to have been, I'm sure, weirded out by these people who speak very differently than she does, in this space that looks very different than Eastern Shore, Maryland. And also, these are people living in a Union-occupied city. And so you're not going to them in the same ways that you would a fugitive, on a slave farm in Bucks County, Maryland. It's a very different thing. So I remember thinking, okay, this has to mean something. As I'm on the panel, to go back to the Southern Historical Association, and I told them, I said it felt almost like a ethnography, like I was, anthropologist or something. Every last one of them had the same experience based on how they were thinking about Tubman. So Etta was in rice fields. Taya goes to a church in upstate New York. Catherine Clinton is on a battlefield, right? And so that's when I'm like, okay, I know I'm doing something right. It's a little unconventional, and I don't know how long it's gonna take, but I'm hoping that, you know, it's gonna lead me into these ways that we might not have read about her before. Yes, and tell me your name. And then I saw the hand in the back too, yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Sophia,
Yes.
and I am enjoying this, and I'm just wondering, as someone in anthropology, would you, I know it's hard to find this information because I also work with a community that doesn't have lots of records themselves. So the kinds of things I look at are rituals that have stayed on, oral stories that have been passed on. And you know, there might be some early recorded songs or stories that you might be able to find that give some hint or artifacts that you can look at. I think that would be really fun and exciting.
I would love it if they let me just get some time off. I'm like, I need a fellowship. I promise you, I'm not trying to indoctrinate your children. Just give me some time in the archives, right? That's all I need. So, you know, that would be wonderful, and I would love to be able to do those things. I would hope that this research takes me to Ghana, takes me to, you know, I've been to Cape May now, you know, I've been to the Low Country, so I'm trying to, you know, I want to do upstate New York and Canada. So, you know, I'm trying to get there. It's just going to take me a little time. But thank you so much, and please email me, Google me, and just send that information so I don't forget. Thank you. Yes.
I have kind of both a comment and a question, if that's
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
The way you were speaking about how you're conducting your work really reminded me of how Sadia Hartman talks about constructing or reconstructing history in A Venus in Two Acts.
Yes.
So I appreciate the way you talk about it, and I enjoy kind of how much of a responsibility
Thank you.
so I really enjoy that. For me, a lot of what I love most about history is in the minutia, right? Like in the tiny little details, the things that like might not make the front page about someone, but are still really fun to find.
Yes.
Are there any facts or anecdotes that you hold on to really closely in your research about Harriet Tubman?
Ooh, so there's one. It's not published. I haven't seen it. Like I said, don't judge me, judge your mama. Because I'm going to tell you a story. So I have an agent, you know, and I get what I call the corporate gigs. And so this is the kind of crowd I'm used to, because it's like, you know, for me, very academic, you know, questions I'm getting. I'm like, okay, I'm used to academic questions, academic adjacent questions. But the corporate gigs, I have to like, my agent has conversations, you know, with what used to be DEI committees, and then say, oh, well, you know, we want to have her speak for Black History Month, or Juneteenth, or Women's History Month on Harriet Tubman, and the ways that we can use Tubman as a you know, symbol for more diversity, but really she should focus on equity. So I did a talk called what Harriet Tubman can teach us about diversity and equity for a commercial real estate firm. They pay quite well, let me just say. And so, see, this is how I know all of y'all are academics, or academic adjacent, because y'all laugh, right? Like all my friends. However, I'm trying to tell you, outside of academia, people are like, oh my gosh, you know, and I try not to speak in a way that's just jargon. So I don't do the, you know, fugitive logic and spherical cartography. So anyway, I'm talking, and then this guy is in the chat, because this is virtual, and he says, I'm related to Harriet Tubman. I was like, wow, thanks for sharing. I mean, I don't know what to do. So the person over emails me the next day and says, no, he is now the family representative, because his aunt she basically has retired from it. She's been doing it for decades, and she's like, let's pass the baton. So I went to Bennett College for undergrad, which is the HBCU for women, the other Spelman. And he went to Morehouse. So what people don't know, Bennett is older than Spelman, so Bennett and Morehouse are actually brother and sister school. So when I found out he's a Morehouse brother, we called each other with Zoom, you know, talking, and then he reads a statement that his family told him to write because he shared my research. And then he said, whenever you are in upstate New York, let me know, because our family wants to show you photographs. There's a photograph of Harriet Tubman and my great-grandfather at her brother's funeral, and his great-grandfather was like 5, sitting on her lap, and these have never been published. So often, you're able to get those kinds of wonderful opportunities, because unlike a lot of people who are like, I just want to write books for my colleagues, or I only want to speak in universities or whatever. I speak in a church basement. I don't care. I've spoken to thousands of people, to 5 people. I just make them go around in a circle and you just talk to each other. So I do things for free. I do things that are compensated. But those are the moments I notice when I'm open to how we can, have diversity and equity through Harriet Tubman, that I was able to speak with the family and get permission to have access to these things. So I'm planning a trip, but those are the things that, it's not marginalia, in that sense. And it's not minutia in the sense that you're talking about, but there's a kind of creativity to bring this information to a larger audience that allows you access. And yeah, so give talks to more than just your colleagues, seriously. Give talks to more than your colleagues. Yes, and then I'm assuming, maybe the last 2, yes. I don't know, is that right for time? You see, I'm doing time management too. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. So my name is Camlisha, and I'm a little late, so pardon if I ask a question that you can quickly answer. I'm interested in what you learned about ways that Harriet has taken care of her mental health, and like a time where therapy and those kind of things weren't made available, and like what you learned about her and how you apply that to your own mental health.
That's a great question. I think, the ice cream parties, she loved ice cream parties with her friends. She loved a good ice cream party. I imagine they kikied, for those who are not used to urban lingo, laughed uproariously. She had ice cream parties, right? And then the other thing, I think, I use this as a tool, the fact that she opened herself to love and the healing power of that. And I think it was just shown in her personal relationship, the adoption of Gertie, who some people, they have suspicions that might have been her daughter. We don't know. That's a suspicion, we will never know. I also think the love of her family. She was extremely close to her nieces and nephews, her siblings, but also her faith. There's no way you can think about Harriet Tubman without connecting her to her spiritual practice. And oftentimes, academics shy away from that, because we're about rationality and those kinds of things. And it can be kind of scary, particularly if you don't share the same religious belief or spiritual practice, or maybe you don't have one at all. But there's no way you can understand how healing her faith was. She invoked Jesus Christ and God all the time. Now, I'm not, I was raised, I think like most people in this country, a Christian. I'm not anymore, I'm a Buddhist. But there is still something, I think, for me when I went to the Low Country and I was in the woods, quite literally the woods by myself, and just thinking about how she felt in that moment with the trees and the different smells and the sounds and looking out to the water, and seeing the fish and sometimes dolphins, and that had to have done something to her spirit, And so I think those are the ways that she healed herself, because I cannot imagine the violence that any person who is owned endures, and to not be a bitter person when she could have been, but to want to help people, and to do so even in her senior years, where she should have been taken care of, she's still taking care of others. I think that is, for me, a lesson in having my life be one of service to others, but also knowing when to kiki. I love a good, people can judge me, but I love a good times episode. Reminds me of my childhood, looking at James and Florida, being frisky and those kinds of things. So I like to, I like nostalgia and I like laughing. And when I feel bad, my husband plays Friday with Ice Cube. He knows if I'm sad, that's gonna make me laugh. So, those are the kinds of things I do, and I have beautiful black art all around my office and my home. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out.